When an alien mother sold herself to feed her starving child, she never expected the human who bought her would choose love instead of exploitation. This HFY science fiction story has become the most requested emotional sci-fi tale in our Space Stories collection, breaking every record for heartwarming sci-fi content. But who was this mysterious human, and what made him different from every other buyer in the galaxy's darkest corners? Set on the dying Omega station, orbiting the wasteland planet, Alpha 16, where desperate refugees sell their very souls for survival. This human-alien relationship would spark a movement that challenges everything we know about found family stories and redemption across the stars. This isn't just another space opera. It's a testament to how one act of kindness can reshape the universe, proving that the best sci-fi audiobook experiences come from stories that touch the deepest parts of our humanity. Marcus Kane knew better than to linger in dying places, but Omega Station bolted like a metallic scab onto the skeletal remains of Alpha 16's forgotten mining complex felt too much like him to ignore. Empty, rusting, and still pretending to function, despite the slow decay eating at its core. He stepped off the transport lift, boots thudding against corrugated grating shoulders hunched against the stale warmth of recycled air that wheezed through overtaxed ventilation systems. Every corridor buzzed faintly, with the persistent hum of overused electronics struggling against entropy, a symphony of technological desperation that had become the soundtrack of the post-Galactic War era. This wasn't the kind of place where HFY stories typically began, yet here Marcus found himself drawn by necessity rather than choice. The station had once been a thriving commercial hub back when Alpha 16's mineral wealth made it worth the investment. Now it served as a gathering point for the desperate, the forgotten, and those who'd stopped pretending they were anything more than survivors. He moved through its metallic ribcage past makeshift stalls draped with plastic tarps, flickering holographic displays advertising salvage tech, and vendors hawking synthetic protein that barely qualified as food. The whole place reeked of desperation masked by industrial lubricants and recycled atmosphere. Marcus hadn't come here for charity or to become part of some heartwarming sci-fi tale about human compassion. He was hunting for parts, a replacement filtration coil for his ship's life support system, maybe an intact fusion regulator, if luck decided to favor him for once. Just enough components to keep the Stardust running until he could find somewhere colder, quieter, and infinitely more empty than this monument to galactic decay. The 42-year-old freight pilot had spent the last 8 years perfecting the art of solitude, turning his ship into a sanctuary where memories couldn't follow, and the ghosts of his former life remained safely locked away. But fate, as it often did in the most compelling space stories, had other plans for Marcus Kane. "Off-books cargo," a vendor muttered from behind a curtain of greasy synthetic beads, his eyes flicking meaningfully toward Marcus's scarred flight jacket. "Human-friendly, if that's your thing. Bay 13. The words hung in the recycled air like a challenge, or perhaps an invitation to become part of something larger than himself. Marcus didn't acknowledge, the vendor didn't even meet his gaze. Every instinct screamed at him to keep walking to complete his business transaction and return to the comfortable isolation of deep space routes where human contact was limited to automated traffic control systems and the occasional distress signal he could choose to ignore. Instead, his feet betrayed him, turning toward Bay 13 with a will of their own. The noise of the main concourse thinned behind him as he walked deeper into the station's bowels where legitimate commerce gave way to the darker necessities of survival. His breath fogged slightly in the cooler corridor, testament to the station's failing environmental systems. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows that made the cramped passageway feel like the throat of some dying beast. He walked like a man not yet sure whether he wanted to find what waited for him in the depths of this mechanical purgatory. Bay 13 was nearly empty when he finally arrived at a cavernous space that had once housed legitimate cargo operations, but now served purposes that existed in the gray areas between legal and necessary. A low hum filled the silence, punctuated by the irregular sputtering of ancient fluorescent strips that provided harsh blue-white illumination. And there, against the far wall under that flickering, industrial light, he saw them. She was kneeling on the cold metal deck, slender arms wrapped protectively around a small child. Her skin was a soft, luminescent blue that reminded Marcus of glacial water under starlight marked with subtle bioluminescent patterns that pulsed faintly with her heartbeat. Her long silver-white hair fell in a thick braid down her back, frayed and uneven as though hastily tied with whatever material she could find. She didn't speak when she noticed him didn't move except for the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip around the child. She simply looked at him with eyes that were wide, distinctly alien in their shape and coloring, and deeply, profoundly tired. The child in her arms, small, maybe 5 or 6 standard years, had the same pale blue skin and silvery hair, but where her mother remained still as carved stone, she stirred faintly against the worn fabric of her mother's clothing. Her hands gripped the folds of what had once been a robe, but now served as blanket shelter, and the last vestige of dignity in a universe that had stripped away everything else. Her eyes, when they opened to study this new arrival, were golden, and too large for her face, holding a wariness that no child should possess. Marcus stopped 2 paces from them, close enough to see the careful way they held themselves, distant enough to avoid seeming threatening. The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient sounds of a dying station and the weight of unspoken desperation. When the woman finally spoke, her voice carried the soft cadence of an alien dialect, smoothed by exhaustion into something that was almost musical, despite its underlying pain. "I have nothing left," she said quietly, each word carefully chosen as though she'd rehearsed this moment countless times. Only her. Her grip on the child tightened almost imperceptibly. "She is hungry." The simple statement carried the weight of a universe of suffering, the kind of profound loss that transformed this encounter from a simple transaction into something that belonged in the most emotional sci-fi stories ever told. Marcus stayed silent, his throat tight with something he hadn't felt in years, the desire to reach out to help, to become part of a found family story, rather than remain a solitary figure drifting through space. The woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I offer myself in trade. Not for pleasure, only for safety. For warmth. For food. For her." The words hung between them like a bridge over an abyss. An offer born of love so pure it transformed degradation into sacrifice. He exhaled slowly, feeling something inside his chest crack like ice under spring sun. "What's your name?" The question surprised them both. In places like this, names were luxuries that people could rarely afford. Identities became secondary to survival, and personal histories were buried beneath the more pressing needs of the present moment. A flicker of surprise crossed her features, the first emotion, other than resigned desperation, that he'd seen. "Zara," she replied, and the name sat gently in the stale air of Bay 13, too beautiful for this ugly place, too full of hope for this moment of surrender. "She's yours?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the child who watched their exchange with the intensity of someone far older than her apparent years. "My daughter," Zara replied, unconsciously tightening her protective embrace. The child raised her head then, and Marcus felt his heart stop as she spoke in a voice that was soft and fragile, as though it might shatter on the way out of her throat. "If I eat too much," she whispered, golden eyes fixed on his face with heartbreaking directness, "will you throw me away?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, awakening something he'd thought permanently buried beneath years of self-imposed isolation. This wasn't just another transaction in the galaxy's endless cycle of exploitation. This was a moment that would define who he chose to be, a crossroads between the man he'd become and the person he might still have the courage to be. In that instant, Marcus Kane realized he wasn't just witnessing someone else's story of desperation. He was being invited to become part of a redemption story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family love and the possibility of healing in a broken universe. The child's question echoed in the empty bay, transforming this encounter from a chance meeting into the beginning of something that would prove human-alien relationships could transcend species circumstances and the cruel arithmetic of survival that governed life in the Outer Rim. What happened next would determine whether this became just another tragic space opera or the kind of heartwarming sci-fi tale that reminded people why stories about found families and second chances continued to resonate across the galaxy. Marcus crouched down until he was eye level with the child, his weathered hands resting gently on his knees. The cold, metal deck of Bay 13 bit through the fabric of his flight suit, but he barely noticed the discomfort. "I don't throw people away," he said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. The words seemed to echo in the cavernous space, creating ripples of possibility in what had moments before been a scene of absolute desperation. Kira blinked at him with those impossibly large golden eyes, studying his face with the intensity of someone far older than her years. Something in his expression must have convinced her because she nodded once, a small movement that felt monumental in its trust. Zara's grip on her daughter loosened slightly, and Marcus caught the faint shimmer of bioluminescent tears tracking down her cheeks, a sight that transformed this encounter from a simple rescue into something that belonged in the most heartwarming sci-fi stories ever told. "Come with me," Marcus said, rising to his feet and extending his hand toward them both. "You'll be safe." The promise hung in the recycled air between them, heavy with implications that none of them fully understood yet. Zara hesitated for a moment, her alien features displaying a complex mixture of hope and disbelief that spoke to months of disappointment and broken promises. But when Kira reached out to take Marcus's offered hand, her mother followed, rising from the cold deck with a grace that spoke of better times and distant worlds. The journey from Bay 13 to the Stardust's docking berth felt like a pilgrimage through layers of human desperation. They passed through corridors where other refugees huddled in makeshift shelters, their eyes following the unlikely trio with expressions that ranged from curiosity to envy. Marcus found himself unconsciously positioning his body between Zara and the watching crowds, a protective instinct awakening that he hadn't felt since the loss of his own family 8 years earlier. This was becoming more than a rescue mission. It was evolving into one of those profound found family stories that demonstrated how HFY narratives could transcend species boundaries and challenge the fundamental assumptions about what constituted home. The Stardust sat in her berth like a faithful old dog, waiting for her master's return. Her hull, scarred by countless jumps through hyperspace, and her registration numbers faded, but still visible in the harsh artificial light of the docking bay. She wasn't much to look at, a mid-range cargo hauler designed for endurance rather than elegance, but she had been Marcus's sanctuary for 8 long years, the only constant in a life dedicated to avoiding meaningful connections with other sentient beings. As they approached the ship's airlock, Marcus felt a sudden uncertainty grip his chest. The Stardust had been configured for solitude, every system optimized for a crew of 1. The guest quarters hadn't been used since he'd purchased the vessel, and the common areas bore the unmistakable marks of a man who had forgotten how to share space with other people. But there was no turning back now, not with Kira's small hand still clutched trustingly in his, not with Zara walking beside him like a woman crossing from one life into another. The airlock cycled with its familiar hiss of equalizing pressure, and then they were aboard, stepping from the industrial decay of Omega Station into a space that, while modest, represented cleanliness and order, and the promise of safety. Marcus watched Zara and Kira's reactions as they took in their new surroundings, seeing his ship through their eyes for the first time in years. The corridors were narrow, but well maintained. the lighting warm rather than harsh, and the air carried the faint scent of recycled atmosphere and machine oil, rather than the desperate stench of unwashed bodies and failing life support systems. "You'll sleep in the guest quarters," Marcus said, gesturing toward a door that had remained sealed for nearly a decade. "The shower's in there too. Towels are clean and the water runs hot most of the time." He paused, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd played host to anyone, let alone refugees whose very presence challenged everything he thought he knew about his own capacity for compassion. Zara didn't respond immediately, her wide eyes taking in every detail of their new environment as though she couldn't quite believe it was real. Her daughter pressed closer to her side, one small hand gripping the fabric of her mother's worn clothing, while the other reached out to touch the smooth wall panels with wondering fingers. The contrast between their obvious exhaustion and the ship's functional comfort created a tableau that belonged in the most emotional sci-fi stories about second chances and unexpected redemption. Marcus moved toward the galley muscle memory, guiding him through the familiar routine of preparing a meal. It had been months since he'd cooked for more than one person, and he found himself pulling down ingredients he'd forgotten he possessed: protein paste that could be flavored dried vegetables that would rehydrate into something resembling real food, and a packet of synthetic grain that would expand into a passable substitute for bread. The act of cooking for others felt strange and wonderful, awakening domestic instincts that had been dormant for nearly a decade. The sounds of running water echoed through the ship's corridors as Zara and Kira made use of the shower facilities, and Marcus found himself smiling at the simple joy audible in Kira's delighted laughter. When had he last heard a child's laughter aboard his ship? The answer was never not, since he'd purchased the Stardust and began his self-imposed exile from the complexities of family life. But now those walls were crumbling, dissolved by the simple act of offering sanctuary to two souls who needed it more than he needed his solitude. By the time they emerged from the guest quarters, clean and wearing the spare clothing Marcus had provided, he had managed to assemble a meal that looked almost appetizing. Zara's silver hair fell in damp waves around her shoulders, and her bioluminescent markings seemed brighter somehow, as though cleanliness had restored some essential vitality that had been dimmed by desperation. Kira bounced on her toes beside her mother, transformed from the frightened waif of Bay 13 into something that looked almost like a normal child. They ate in the ship's small common area, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. Marcus watched as Kira attacked her food with the focused intensity of someone who had gone too long between meals, while Zara ate more slowly, her eyes never quite leaving her daughter's face. It was a scene that could have come from any number of heartwarming science fiction stories about human-alien relationships, transcending the barriers of species and circumstance. "Where are you from?" Marcus asked, eventually, setting down his utensil and leaning back in his chair. The question opened floodgates of memory and pain, but also of beauty and loss that painted a picture of worlds and lives that existed far beyond the cramped confines of dying space stations. Zara's fingers found Kira's hair, stroking it with unconscious tenderness as she spoke. "Veltara," she said, her voice taking on a musical quality that spoke of wind through alien forests and sunlight filtered through canopies of impossible colors. "A forest world in the outer reach. We lived near the sky water, what you would call a lake. It sang in the morning when the thermal currents carried music from the crystal formations beneath the surface." The image she painted was so vivid that Marcus could almost hear the alien melodies she described, could almost see the bioluminescent patterns that would dance across the water's surface at dawn. This was what made the best space stories so compelling, not the technology or the battles, but the glimpses of beauty and wonder that existed in the vast darkness between stars. "But there was sickness," Zara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "No medicine, no credits for treatment. My mate Oren, he fell first. Kira was too young to remember." Her thumb traced gentle circles across her daughter's forehead, a gesture so tender it made Marcus's chest ache with recognition. The healer said I was impure unclean. They said my family line was a waste of resources. The casual cruelty of those words hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him of all the reasons why HFY stories resonated so deeply with readers across the galaxy. In a universe where sentient beings could be discarded like defective equipment, acts of basic decency became revolutionary. The fact that he was sitting here sharing a meal with two refugees who had been deemed unworthy by their own society felt like a small rebellion against the forces that reduced living beings to economic calculations. "You're not unclean," Marcus said quietly, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "You're a mother protecting her child. That's the most human thing there is, regardless of species." Zara's bioluminescent markings pulsed brighter for a moment, and she looked at him with an expression that mingled gratitude with something deeper, a recognition that perhaps, for the first time in months, she was being seen as a person rather than a commodity. Kira had finished her meal and was now exploring the common area with the boundless curiosity of childhood, her fingers tracing the edges of control panels, and her voice rising in delighted exclamations as she discovered each new wonder. "Papa," she said suddenly, turning toward Marcus with an expression of absolute trust that stopped his heart. "Can I see the stars?" The word "Papa" hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible gulf, transforming this rescue mission into something that belonged in the most profound found family stories ever told. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth spreading through his body that he hadn't experienced since before the accident that had claimed his wife and daughter. He looked at Zara, expecting to see disapproval or concern, but found only a soft smile and eyes that gleamed with something that might have been hope. "I don't mind," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "If you want to call me that, I don't mind at all." Kira's answering smile was like sunrise after endless night, and Marcus realized that somewhere in the space between Bay 13 and this moment, he had become part of something larger than himself. This wasn't just about providing sanctuary to refugees. This was about the formation of a family unit that transcended biology and species, a testament to the power of chosen connections over blood relations. As they made their way to the observation deck, Marcus activated the ship's external cameras, filling the small viewport with a panoramic view of space that took their breath away. Stars stretched across the darkness like scattered diamonds, and in the distance, the bulk of Alpha 16 turned slowly on its axis, its surface scarred by centuries of industrial exploitation, but still possessed of a terrible beauty. "It's beautiful," Zara whispered, her hand finding Marcus's arm as they stood together in the soft glow of the starfield. "I had forgotten that beauty still existed." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. In the months since he'd lost his family, he had seen only the harsh realities of survival, the endless cycle of cargo runs and mechanical repairs that had kept him moving but not living. But now, standing here with Zara and Kira, he remembered what it felt like to see wonder in the universe again. That night, as they settled into sleep aboard the Stardust, Marcus lay in his bunk, listening to the soft sounds of breathing from the guest quarters, and feeling something like peace settle over his soul. This was how the best redemption stories began, not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with small acts of kindness that opened doors to possibilities none of them had imagined. But even as contentment washed over him, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was fragile, that forces beyond their control were already moving to shatter this newfound sanctuary. In the darkness of space, predators were stirring, and the price of love would prove higher than any of them could have imagined. The scream tore through the Stardust's quiet corridors like a blade through silk, jolting Marcus from restless sleep and sending him stumbling toward the guest quarters before his mind fully processed what he was hearing. Even in sleep, trauma followed them, pursuing Kira through dreams with the relentless persistence of a hunter tracking wounded prey. When he reached the doorway, he found Zara already there, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with distress as she gathered her daughter into her arms, whispering soothing words in the musical language of their homeworld. "It's okay, little star," Zara murmured, her voice carrying harmonies that seemed to calm something primal in Kira's terror. "You're safe now. We're both safe." But even as she spoke the words, Marcus could see the doubt in her expression, the way her eyes darted toward the shadows as though expecting threats to materialize from the darkness. This was what made their story more than just another space adventure. It was becoming one of those profound, emotional sci-fi narratives about healing and the long journey from trauma to trust. Marcus hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether his presence would help or intrude upon this moment of vulnerable intimacy. But Kira's golden eyes found his face across the dimly lit room, and she extended one small hand toward him with a gesture that was both invitation and plea. "Papa," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of nightmares and the desperate hope for comfort that only a parent could provide. The simple word broke through every defense Marcus had constructed around his heart, and he crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the narrow bunk where mother and daughter clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. "I'm here," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotions he'd thought buried beyond resurrection. "Both of you are safe. Nothing's going to hurt you while I'm here." 3 days had passed since they'd left Omega Station, 3 days of floating through the deep void between systems, while Marcus plotted a course toward the sanctuary worlds, those distant colonies that had declared neutrality in the galaxy's endless conflicts, and offered refuge to those seeking to escape the brutal economics of survival. The Stardust hummed around them with the steady rhythm of a mechanical heartbeat, life support systems working overtime to maintain atmosphere and temperature for 3 souls, instead of the solitary occupant she'd been designed to serve. But even in the peaceful isolation of deep space, the ghosts of their respective pasts haunted every quiet moment. Marcus found himself watching Zara and Kira with a mixture of protective tenderness and bone-deep fear that this fragile peace would shatter like every other good thing in his life. The rational part of his mind whispered that attachment was dangerous, that caring about someone meant providing the universe with new ways to break your heart. Yet, every time Kira smiled at him across the dinner table, every time Zara's fingers brushed his hand as she passed him a tool during routine maintenance, those defenses crumbled a little more. "Tell me about them," Zara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence of the ship's common area, where they'd gathered after Kira had finally fallen back into peaceful sleep. "Your family. The ones you lost." Her directness was typical of her species, Marcus had learned. The Velterans valued emotional honesty above social comfort, believing that shared pain was the foundation of genuine connection between sentient beings. Marcus set down the maintenance report he'd been pretending to read and looked at her across the small table where they'd shared meals that were beginning to feel like family dinners. "Her name was Zara," he said, surprised by how easily the words came after years of silence. "We met on Kepler Station when I was still flying military transports. She was a xenobiologist studying the effects of terraforming on indigenous ecosystems." Emma was 5, about Kira's age, with her mother's curiosity and her father's stubborn streak. The memories came flooding back with surprising clarity, as though speaking their names had opened a door that had been sealed for 8 years. He could see Sarah's face as clearly as though she were sitting across from him, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and compassion, her laugh echoing through the corridors of their small apartment on Colony 7. Emma had been a whirlwind of energy and questions, always wanting to know how things worked, why stars shone, whether the alien fish in the terraforming ponds had feelings like human children. The colony was built on an unstable foundation. Marcus continued, his voice growing distant as he relived those final hours. Cost-cutting measures during construction. The geological surveys had identified stress fractures in the bedrock, but the corporate overseers decided the risk was acceptable. Sarah and Emma were in the residential sector when the supports failed. I was off-world running supplies to the outer settlements. By the time I got back, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that had haunted his dreams for nearly a decade. Zara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her alien warmth a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. "You couldn't have known," she said simply, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with sympathy. "The universe is full of tragedies that no one could have prevented. Believing otherwise is a form of madness that serves no purpose except to multiply suffering." "I keep thinking I should have been there." Marcus admitted, the words coming out in a rush as though a dam had burst in his chest. "That if I'd stayed, maybe I could have gotten them out in time. Maybe I could have saved them, instead of spending the rest of my life running cargo between meaningless destinations, avoiding any place that might remind me of what I lost. And if you had stayed, you would have died with them." Zara replied with the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with the arbitrary cruelties of existence. "Then you wouldn't have been in Bay 13 when Kira and I needed you most. Sometimes the greatest acts of love happen decades before we meet the people who need us to love them." Her words hit him like a revelation, reframing his years of self-imposed exile not as punishment for his failures but as preparation for this moment. This was what made the best HFY stories so compelling. They showed how human resilience could transform tragedy into purpose, how the darkest chapters of our lives could become the foundation for someone else's redemption. "Tell me about Oren," Marcus said, recognizing that this exchange of painful memories was a form of communion, a sharing of wounds that somehow made them both stronger. "What was he like?" Zara's expression softened, her alien features taking on a luminous quality that made Marcus understand why the Velterans were considered among the most beautiful species in the galaxy. "He was a tree singer," she said, her voice taking on the musical cadence that always accompanied her memories of home. "On Veltara, we believe that every living thing has a song, a frequency that resonates with the fundamental harmony of existence. Oren could hear the music of the great forest, could sing the trees into new growth patterns, could heal the wounded earth with melodies that touched the very soul of our world." She paused, her fingers tracing abstract patterns on the table's surface as though drawing musical notations in the air. "He would sing to me when I was carrying Kira these ancient songs that were supposed to ensure a child's health and happiness. After she was born, he would hold her for hours, humming lullabies that made her bioluminescent markings pulse in rhythm with his voice. She was going to be a tree singer too, we thought. She had the gift." "What happened?" Marcus asked gently, though he could already guess the broad outlines of the tragedy that had driven them from their forest paradise to the desperate marketplace of Omega Station. "The sky sickness," Zara replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It came from the mining operations in the outer system, heavy metals and radiation poisoning that settled into our atmosphere like a toxic fog. The tree singers were affected first because they were so deeply connected to the living world. Oren began losing his voice, then his ability to hear the forest's music. By the end, he could barely speak at all." Marcus could see the pain of those memories etched in every line of her face, could hear the echo of helpless rage in her voice as she continued. "The healers said it was a genetic weakness, that our bloodline was contaminated. They refused to treat Oren, claimed that helping him would be a waste of resources that could be used to save pure Velterans. They said I was selfish for asking them to save someone who was already condemned by his inferior genetics." The casual cruelty of that judgment made Marcus's jaw clench with anger, but Zara wasn't finished. "After Oren died, they exiled us. Said that Kira carried the same genetic flaws, that her presence would contaminate the other children. They took our home, our community, everything we had built together. We became refugees on our own world, forced to live in the wasteland beyond the forest's edge." "That's when you left Veltara," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. Zara nodded, her bioluminescent markings dimming as she relived the darkest chapter of her life. A trader offered us passage to the Rim World's promised work and a chance to start over. I hoped that maybe among strangers, Kira could have a normal childhood. I was so naive. The trader sold us to the Narco Consortium the moment we were clear of Velteran space. They processed us like cargo, implanted tracking chips, assigned us catalog numbers. I became merchandise, and Kira became leverage to ensure my cooperation. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an abyss of shared pain, connecting two souls who had been broken by loss and betrayed by those who should have protected them. Marcus felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what they were building together. This wasn't just a rescue mission that had evolved into temporary companionship. This was the foundation of something that belonged in the most powerful found family stories, a chosen connection that transcended the accidents of birth and species. I couldn't save Orin. Zara continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. I couldn't save my homeworld or my people's respect, but I could save Kira, even if it meant selling myself in the darkest corner of the galaxy. That's what mothers do. We make whatever sacrifices are necessary to protect our children, even when it costs us everything we thought we were. Marcus understood that sacrifice in a way that went beyond words, beyond the boundaries of human and alien experience. You didn't sell yourself, he said firmly. You were offering everything you had to protect the person you loved most. That's not commerce, that's heroism. And you didn't fail Sarah and Emma. Zara replied, her golden eyes meeting his with perfect understanding. You honored their memory by becoming the kind of man who would save strangers in a place where no one else cared enough to help. Every act of kindness you've shown us, every moment of safety you've provided, that's their legacy living on through you. The truth of her words settled into Marcus's bones like warmth returning to frostbitten flesh, and for the first time in 8 years he felt something like peace with his past. This was what made their story more than just another space opera about adventure and conflict. It was becoming a profound exploration of how love could transcend death, how the capacity for compassion could be passed from one generation to the next like a genetic inheritance of the soul. Papa. Kira's voice drifted from the guest quarters, sleepy, but no longer afraid. Can you sing me a song like Mama's papa used to sing? Marcus looked at Zara, who smiled and nodded with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that healing happened in small moments of connection rather than grand gestures of heroism. I don't know any tree songs, he called back, his voice carrying the warmth of newfound purpose, but I can try. As he made his way toward the guest quarters, Marcus caught Zara's hand in his, squeezing gently before letting go. Thank you, he said simply, and she understood that he was thanking her for more than just the conversation. He was thanking her for showing him that redemption was possible, that the human capacity for love could survive even the most devastating losses. The proximity alarm chose that moment to begin its insistent beeping, shattering the peaceful intimacy of the moment, and sending both adults rushing toward the cockpit. The scanner showed 3 ships approaching from the direction of Alpha 16, their signatures matching no known configuration in the civilian databases. Marcus's blood ran cold as he recognized the aggressive flight pattern of pursuit vessels, the kind used by organizations that operated outside the boundaries of civilized law. They found us, Zara whispered, her face draining of color as she stared at the tactical display. The Narco Consortium, they've been tracking us since we left Omega Station. Marcus's hands flew over the controls, bringing the Stardust's engines online and beginning evasive maneuvers that would test every skill he'd learned during his military service. Not if I can help it, he said grimly, his voice carrying the steel determination of a man who had found something worth fighting for. They're not taking you back, either of you. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew that their peaceful interlude was over. The past had caught up with them, and the price of the love they were building together would be measured in blood and sacrifice. The galaxy had shown them a glimpse of what happiness could look like, and now it was preparing to demand payment for that brief moment of grace. The proximity alarms shrieked through the Stardust's corridors like banshees announcing the approach of death, their harsh, electronic wails shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the small family in the wake of their shared confessions. Marcus's hands flew across the control panel with the practiced efficiency of someone whose military training had never truly left him. His fingers dancing over switches and displays as he brought the ship's defensive systems online and began plotting evasive maneuvers that would test every skill he'd learned during his years of service. They'd found her, he muttered, his voice tight with grim determination, as the tactical display resolved into a constellation of red dots closing in on their position. 3 ships running dark until they'd achieved sensor lock, their aggressive formation and synchronized approach patterns, marking them as professional hunters rather than opportunistic pirates. The Narco Consortium never sent amateurs to retrieve their lost merchandise, and the fact that they'd managed to track the Stardust through 3 days of deep space navigation spoke to resources and determination that made Marcus's blood run cold. "How many?" Zara asked, her voice steady, despite the fear that pulsed through her bioluminescent markings like a living thing. She'd moved to stand beside him at the control station, her alien features composed but her hands trembling slightly as she watched the tactical readout. This was the moment she'd been dreading since they'd left Omega Station, the inevitable reckoning with forces that viewed her not as a sentient being but as stolen property that needed to be recovered. 3 pursuit ships, Marcus replied, his military training asserting itself as he fell into the familiar rhythm of combat analysis. Consortium design modified for long-range tracking and interdiction. They've been following our ion trail since we left Alpha 16, probably had sensors planted throughout the station's shipping lanes. He paused, his jaw clenching, as the implications sank in. They're not here to negotiate. The lead ship's communication array crackled to life, filling the cockpit with a voice that carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Unidentified cargo vessel, this is Captain Vex of the Consortium Enforcement Division. You are harboring stolen property belonging to our organization. Surrender the Velteran female and her offspring, and we will allow your ship to depart unmolested." Marcus's finger hovered over the communication switch for a moment before he made his decision. "This is Captain Kane of the independent freighter Stardust," he replied, his voice carrying the steel of someone who had faced death before and found it wanting. "The passengers aboard my ship are refugees under my protection. I suggest you find some other way to spend your time." The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring broken only by the steady hum of the ship's engines and the soft whimper of fear that escaped from Kira as she pressed herself against her mother's side. Then Captain Vex's laughter filled the cockpit, a sound devoid of humor and full of the kind of casual cruelty that had made the Consortium's reputation throughout the Outer Rim. "Protection," Vex replied, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're protecting stolen merchandise, Captain. That Velteran whore and her spawn represent a significant investment on our part, and we don't take kindly to theft. You have 60 seconds to comply before we demonstrate why crossing the Consortium is inadvisable." Marcus felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest, a righteous anger that belonged in the best HFY stories about ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. "They're not merchandise," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "They're family, and I don't negotiate with slavers." The communication channel went dead, and Marcus could see the pursuit ships spreading into attack formation, their weapons systems coming online in a synchronized display of professional menace. This was it, the moment when their peaceful journey toward sanctuary would transform into something that belonged in the most intense space stories ever told, a desperate flight through the void with everything they'd built together hanging in the balance. "Kira, get to the emergency shelter." Marcus said, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "Zara, I need you to monitor the power systems and watch for any fluctuations. This is going to get rough." He engaged the engines at full burn, feeling the Stardust leap forward like a thoroughbred responding to the touch of spurs. The old girl had been built for cargo hauling rather than combat, but she still had enough power to make their pursuers work for their prize. The first energy blast scorched past the ship's hull close enough to overload several external sensors and send warning lights cascading across the control panel. Marcus threw the ship into a spiraling dive that would have been impossible in atmosphere, using the three-dimensional nature of space combat to present a constantly shifting target while maintaining course toward the nearby asteroid field. If he could reach the cover of those tumbling rocks, he might be able to lose their pursuers in the maze of stone and metal that drifted between the star systems. "They're gaining on us." Zara reported, her voice tight with controlled fear as she watched the tactical display. "Lead ship is moving to intercept our course to the asteroid field." Her hands moved across the power distribution controls with surprising skill, rerouting energy from non-essential systems to the engines and defensive shields. "I can give you maybe 10% more power, but it won't be sustainable for long." Marcus nodded, his attention focused on the delicate dance of pursuit and evasion that would determine whether they lived to see another day. The consortium ships were faster and better armed, but they were also larger and less maneuverable than the Stardust. If he could use that advantage, if he could force them into situations where their superior firepower became a liability rather than an asset, he might be able to level the playing field long enough to reach safety. "There." Kira's voice called from the emergency shelter, high and bright with excitement, despite the danger surrounding them. "Papa, there's a big rock with holes in it." Her childish observation cut through the tension like a blade, and Marcus found himself smiling despite the circumstances. From the mouths of babes came wisdom, and in this case, salvation. The asteroid she'd spotted was a hollowed-out shell of nickel iron, probably the remains of some ancient mining operation that had been abandoned when the resources were exhausted. But those tunnels and caverns would provide cover from the consortium's armor sensors, and if Marcus could thread the needle just right, he might be able to disappear into the rock's embrace before their pursuers could follow. "Hold on," he called out, his hands dancing across the controls as he began the most dangerous maneuver of his life. The Stardust dove toward the asteroid's surface, her hull screaming as she pushed through the thin atmosphere of gas and dust that surrounded the rocky body. Behind them, the pursuit ships opened fire with everything they had, turning space into a deadly light show of energy beams and projectile weapons. One blast found its mark, sending shockwaves through the ship's structure and filling the cockpit with the acrid smell of burning insulation. "Hull breach in Section 7. Zara reported, her voice steady despite the emergency lights that now bathed the control room in angry red. "Emergency bulkheads are holding, but we've lost atmosphere in the aft cargo bay." Marcus gritted his teeth and continued his desperate dive toward the asteroid's surface, feeling the ship shudder around him as more enemy fire found its mark. The rocky surface rushed toward them with terrifying speed, growing larger until it filled the entire viewport. At the last possible second, he pulled the ship into a screaming turn that brought them parallel to the asteroid's surface, skimming along its cratered landscape with barely meters to spare. The tunnel entrance loomed before them like the mouth of some primordial cave carved into the stone by automated mining equipment decades ago. Marcus aimed the Stardust's nose toward that dark opening and prayed to whatever gods might be listening that his calculations were correct. The ship plunged into the asteroid's interior with inches to spare her hull, scraping against the tunnel walls in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. Behind them, the first pursuit ship attempted to follow, but its larger size and less nimble handling made the maneuver impossible. The consortium vessel clipped the tunnel entrance and spun away in a shower of debris, its hull cracked and atmosphere venting into space. The other two ships circled the asteroid like frustrated predators, their weapon systems still locked onto the Stardust's fading sensor signature. "We're in," Marcus announced, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. "But they're still out there, and they're not going to give up easily." He guided the ship deeper into the asteroid's interior, following a maze of tunnels that had once been home to massive mining equipment. The rocky walls provided shelter from enemy sensors, but they also trapped them in a labyrinth where one wrong turn could mean collision with stone that had been floating in space since before humanity had learned to walk upright. "How long can we stay hidden?" Zara asked, her hands still working to reroute power around the damaged systems. Her bioluminescent markings had dimmed to barely visible, a sign of the stress she was under despite her outward calm. This was what made their story more than just another space opera adventure. It was becoming a profound exploration of how found family bonds could survive even the most desperate circumstances. "Not long enough." Marcus admitted, his attention split between navigating the tunnel system and monitoring the external sensors for signs of their pursuers. "They know we're in here, and they've got enough firepower to crack this rock open if they want to dig us out. We need to find another way out, and we need to do it before they bring up reinforcements." The ship's computer chimed softly, indicating that it had mapped enough of the tunnel system to provide navigation assistance. Marcus studied the holographic display, looking for a path that would take them to the far side of the asteroid without exposing them to enemy fire. There, a main shaft that ran almost the entire length of the rocky body, emerging in a cluster of smaller tunnels that would provide multiple escape routes. "I've got a plan," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found hope in the darkest hour. "But it's going to require perfect timing and more luck than we have any right to expect." He began entering course corrections into the navigation system, plotting a route that would take them through the asteroid's heart toward the far side. "We're going to punch through to the other side and make a run for the jump point. If we can reach hyperspace before they react, we might have a chance." "And if we can't?" Zara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Then we make them pay for every meter," Marcus replied grimly. "I'm not letting them take you back, either of you." The words carried the weight of absolute conviction, the kind of commitment that transformed ordinary people into heroes in the most powerful human-alien relationship stories ever told. As the Stardust made its way through the asteroid's interior, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. Days ago, he had been a solitary cargo hauler, avoiding meaningful connections and running from the ghosts of his past. Now he was part of something larger, something that transcended the accidents of birth and species to create bonds that were stronger than blood. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, whether they escaped or died trying, he knew that he had finally found something worth fighting for. The exit tunnel loomed ahead, a circle of starlight that represented either freedom or the end of everything they had built together. Marcus gripped the control stick tighter and prepared to bet everything on one desperate gamble. Behind them, the consortium ships waited like patient predators, their weapon systems charged and ready. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the price of love would be measured in courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that made their story one of the most compelling redemption stories in the galaxy. The universe was about to learn what happened when someone threatened the family that Marcus Kane had chosen to protect. The Stardust's final approach to the barren moon was less landing than controlled crash, her damaged engines sputtering and failing as Marcus fought to bring the ship down in something resembling one piece. The rocky surface rushed toward them through the cracked viewport, an endless expanse of gray stone and ancient impact craters that spoke of eons spent absorbing the universe's casual violence. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in angry red as system after system reported failure, the ship's computer announcing their desperate situation with the dispassionate calm of a machine that had no emotional investment in their survival. "Brace for impact." Marcus called out, his voice tight with concentration as he used every trick he'd learned during his military service to coax a few more seconds of controlled flight from the dying engines. Behind him, he could hear Zara securing anything that might become a projectile during touchdown, her movements quick and efficient despite the fear that pulsed through her bioluminescent markings like a living thing. Kira's small voice rose above the cacophony of failing systems counting down the seconds, until impact with the kind of brave curiosity that made their story more than just another space adventure. It was becoming one of those profound, emotional sci-fi narratives about the lengths people would go to protect the ones they loved. The ship hit the moon's surface with bone-jarring force, skipping twice across the rocky terrain, before grinding to a halt in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The sudden silence that followed felt almost supernatural after the chaos of the past few minutes, broken only by the steady hiss of atmosphere leaking from damaged hull sections and the soft whimper of pain that escaped Marcus's lips as he tried to unfasten his crash restraints with hands that shook from more than just adrenaline. "Everyone alive?" He managed to ask, his voice hoarse from breathing recycled air that tasted of smoke and fear. The question seemed almost absurd, given their circumstances, but it was the kind of dark humor that had kept him sane during the worst moments of his military career. They had maybe 48 hours before the ship's life support systems failed completely, maybe less if the hull breaches were worse than the diagnostics indicated. "We're okay," Zara replied, though Marcus could see the careful way she held her left arm and the darker patches in her bioluminescent markings that indicated injury. "Kira's fine, just shaken up, but you're bleeding." She moved toward him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies before, her hands gentle but firm as she examined the gash across his forehead where flying debris had found its mark during the crash. The desolate mining moon that had become their temporary refuge was a testament to humanity's endless appetite for exploitation and abandonment. Orbital surveys showed the skeletal remains of colonial-era extraction facilities scattered across the surface like the bones of some vast mechanical beast, their empty shells providing potential shelter, but also serving as reminders of how quickly civilization could collapse when the resources ran dry. The thin atmosphere was barely breathable, requiring emergency oxygen supplies for any extended surface activity, but it would provide some protection from the cosmic radiation that bathed this corner of space. "The good news is that we're alive, and the consortium ships are still circling the asteroid field," Marcus said, wincing as Zara applied a biopatch to his forehead wound. "The bad news is that we're stranded on a dead rock with limited supplies and no way to repair the primary engines." He pulled up the damage assessment on his portable scanner, studying the readouts with the grim satisfaction of someone who had expected the worst and been proven right. "How long do we have?" Zara asked, though her tone suggested she was already calculating their options based on the medical supplies she'd inventoried and the power consumption rates of their essential systems. This was what made their relationship more than just a typical human-alien romance. It was grounded in practical concerns and mutual competence rather than dramatic gestures and impossible promises. "Life support will hold for maybe 2 days if we're careful with power consumption," Marcus replied, his attention split between the scanner readouts and the need to appear confident for Kira's sake. "The hull breaches are sealed for now, but the atmospheric processors are running at 30% efficiency. We need to find shelter and figure out a way to extend our operational time while I work on the engines." Kira had been remarkably quiet during this exchange, her golden eyes moving between the adults with the kind of thoughtful attention that suggested she understood far more about their situation than a 6-year-old should have to comprehend. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to accept crisis as a normal part of existence. "Are the bad men still looking for us?" she asked, her small hand reaching out to take Marcus's larger one in a gesture that was both seeking comfort and offering it. Will they find us here? They're still out there, Marcus admitted, seeing no point in lying to someone who had already survived more hardship than most adults ever faced. But this moon isn't on any of the standard navigation charts, and our engine signature is cold. As long as we stay quiet and keep our power output minimal, they shouldn't be able to detect us. He squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how this child had become the emotional center of their makeshift family unit. The abandoned mining facility they'd spotted during their descent turned out to be more intact than the surface scans had suggested, its main structure built into the side of a crater wall to provide protection from meteor impacts and solar radiation. The airlock still functioned, though the atmosphere inside was stale and thin, requiring them to wear emergency respirators while they explored the interconnected chambers that had once housed hundreds of workers and their support equipment. "This will work," Zara announced after completing her survey of the facility's medical bay, her voice muffled by the respirator but carrying a note of professional satisfaction. "The environmental systems are offline, but the basic infrastructure is sound. If we can reroute power from the ship, we should be able to maintain life support for significantly longer than 48 hours. Marcus nodded, already mentally cataloging the modifications they would need to make to their temporary shelter. But there was another problem that none of them had yet spoken aloud, though he could see the knowledge of it in Zara's eyes every time she thought he wasn't looking. The tracking device that the consortium had implanted in her body was still active, still broadcasting their location to anyone with the right frequency scanner. As long as it remained in place, they would never be truly safe, never be able to disappear into the vast anonymity of space. "We need to talk, he said quietly, waiting until Kira had become absorbed in exploring the facility's recreational area before broaching the subject that had been weighing on all their minds. "The tracking chip, it has to come out." Zara's bioluminescent markings dimmed to almost nothing, a sure sign of the stress she was feeling despite her outward calm. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about it since we left Omega Station. The problem is that it's embedded in my chest cavity close to major blood vessels. Surgery without proper medical facilities." She trailed off, but they both understood the implications. "You could die." Marcus finished the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "But if we leave it in place, they'll eventually track us down. The consortium doesn't give up easily, and they have resources we can't match." He found himself thinking about the best HFY stories he'd ever heard, tales of ordinary people facing impossible choices and finding the courage to do what needed to be done regardless of the personal cost. "I can do it," Zara said with quiet determination. "My people have extensive knowledge of surgical procedures, and I've assisted with similar operations before. The medical bay here has basic surgical equipment, and if we can stabilize the power supply—" She was already moving toward the surgical suite, her mind shifting into the focused calm that medical professionals adopted when facing life-or-death situations. Marcus felt his heart clench with fear and admiration for this remarkable woman who continued to amaze him with her strength and resilience. "You can't operate on yourself," he protested, though he could see from her expression that she had already made up her mind. "The angle is wrong, the risk of complications too high. If something goes wrong, then you'll take care of Kira," Zara replied simply, her words cutting through his objections with the quiet authority of someone who had already accepted the risks and decided they were worth taking. "She trusts you completely now. She calls you Papa, not because she's forgotten her real father, but because she understands that family is about choice as much as blood. You've given us both something we thought we'd lost forever, hope for a future that doesn't involve running and hiding." The preparation for surgery took several hours, during which Marcus found himself performing tasks he'd never imagined would be necessary when he'd started this journey as a simple cargo hauler, avoiding meaningful human connections. He helped sterilize surgical instruments with equipment designed for maintaining mining machinery, rigged emergency lighting that would provide adequate illumination for delicate work, and tried not to think about all the ways this desperate plan could go wrong. Kira proved to be surprisingly helpful during the preparations, her small hands perfect for organizing medical supplies, and her calm presence a comfort to both adults as they faced the reality of what they were about to attempt. She seemed to understand intuitively that her mother was about to undergo something dangerous, but rather than becoming fearful or clingy, she displayed the kind of quiet courage that transformed their story from simple adventure into one of the most powerful found family narratives ever told. "Will Mama be okay?" she asked Marcus during a quiet moment, her golden eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone searching for truth beneath polite reassurances. Really okay, not just pretend okay. Marcus knelt down to meet her gaze at eye level, remembering another child in another time who had asked him questions he couldn't answer with certainty. But this time was different. This time he had the chance to be the protector he'd failed to be before. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she's okay," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "And afterward, when she's better, we're going to find a place where we can all be safe together. A real home." The surgery itself was a testament to both Zara's medical knowledge and her incredible willpower. Marcus served as her assistant, following her precise instructions, while trying not to think about the implications of every small mistake or moment of hesitation. The tracking device was exactly where she'd predicted, a crystalline chip, no larger than a grain of rice, but embedded so deeply in her chest tissue that removing it required surgical precision that pushed the limits of their improvised medical facility. "There," Zara whispered, her voice weak but triumphant, as she finally extracted the device and held it up to the surgical light. The tiny chip glinted like a malevolent star, a physical symbol of the consortium's claim of ownership over her body and life. Freedom has a price, but some things are worth paying for. The complications began almost immediately. Blood loss from damaged vessels, infection risk from the less than sterile surgical environment, and the simple shock of major surgery performed under emergency conditions all combined to push Zara's body beyond its limits. For terrifying hours, Marcus found himself playing medic to someone whose knowledge far exceeded his own, following her whispered instructions while watching her life signs fluctuate between stability and crisis. "Stay with me," he found himself repeating like a mantra, his hands steady, despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "Kira needs you. I need you. We're family now, remember. Families don't leave each other behind." The words seemed to anchor something in Zara's consciousness, pulling her back from the edge of unconsciousness each time her body tried to surrender to the trauma. Kira remained at her mother's bedside throughout the crisis, her small hand holding Zara's larger one, while she hummed the tree songs that her father had taught her before his death. The ancient melodies seemed to resonate with something fundamental in Zara's physiology, her bioluminescent markings pulsing in rhythm with the musical patterns in a way that suggested healing properties beyond simple comfort. It was during the darkest hour, when Zara's vital signs had dropped to dangerous levels, and Marcus was preparing himself for the possibility of losing her, that she opened her eyes and spoke with surprising clarity. "The chip," she whispered, her gaze finding the tiny device where Marcus had placed it on the surgical tray. "Destroy it. Make sure they can never use it to track anyone else." Marcus picked up the tracking device and studied its intricate crystalline structure, marveling at the sophisticated technology that had been used to reduce a sentient being to the status of inventory. Without hesitation, he placed it on the surgical table and brought a medical hammer down on its surface, shattering the chip into fragments that would never again serve the consortium's purposes. The destruction of the tracking device seemed to mark a turning point in Zara's recovery. Her vital signs stabilized, her bioluminescent markings began to brighten, and for the first time in hours, Marcus allowed himself to believe that she might actually survive the ordeal. As he watched her sleep peacefully with Kira curled up beside her on the narrow medical bed, he realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship dynamic. This was no longer about rescue or temporary sanctuary. This was about family in the truest sense of the word, about people who had chosen each other, despite every obstacle the universe had placed in their path. They had survived the worst the consortium could throw at them, had overcome injuries that should have been fatal, and had emerged stronger for the experience. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a unit that transcended the artificial boundaries of species and origin. Freedom came with a price, Marcus murmured, echoing Zara's earlier words as he watched over his chosen family. But some things are worth paying for. Outside the abandoned mining facility, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small drama of love and survival playing out on the barren moon below. But inside that makeshift shelter, 3 souls had found something precious enough to fight for something that would prove stronger than the forces arrayed against them. Their story was becoming one of the most compelling space opera narratives ever told, a testament to the power of chosen family, and the lengths people would go to protect those they loved. 3 weeks after the surgery that had nearly claimed Zara's life, the Stardust lifted off from the barren moon with engines that purred like a contented cat, her hull patched, and her systems restored to something approaching operational efficiency. They needed to disappear completely. Marcus knew to find sanctuary somewhere beyond the consortium's reach before Captain Vex and his hunters could regroup and resume their pursuit. The destroyed tracking chip had bought them time, but it wouldn't take long for the enemy to realize their quarry had gone dark and begin systematic sweeps of nearby systems. Haven Station, Zara said quietly, her voice still slightly hoarse from the ordeal she'd endured, but carrying a note of hope that hadn't been there since they'd first met in Bay 13. It's a neutral territory in the Kepler sector beyond consortium jurisdiction. They take refugees, no questions asked, and they have defensive capabilities that make them too expensive for criminal organizations to challenge. Her bioluminescent markings had returned to their normal brightness, pulsing gently with the rhythm of someone whose body was finally beginning to heal from months of accumulated trauma. Marcus studied the star charts displayed on the navigation console, calculating jump distances and fuel consumption while trying not to think about all the ways their desperate gamble could still go wrong. Haven Station represented more than just sanctuary. It offered the possibility of a genuine home for Kira, somewhere she could attend school and make friends and experience the kind of normal childhood that had been stolen from her by circumstances beyond her control. This was what elevated their story above typical space adventures and transformed it into one of those profound found family stories that reminded readers why the bonds we choose can be stronger than those we inherit. How long until we reach the jump point? Kira asked from her position at the observation port, her golden eyes reflecting the starfield beyond as she watched the moon shrink behind them. She had adapted to life aboard the ship with the remarkable resilience of childhood, turning what could have been a terrifying experience into an adventure filled with new discoveries and the comforting presence of adults who would protect her at any cost. 6 hours to the primary jump point, Marcus replied, his attention split between the navigation display and the sensor array that monitored their surrounding space for signs of pursuit. Then 3 more jumps to reach Haven Station, assuming we don't run into any complications. He didn't mention the consortium patrol routes that intersected their planned course, or the fact that their ship's damaged transponder would mark them as suspicious to any authority that bothered to scan them. The journey through hyperspace gave them time to plan for what came next, to discuss the practicalities of building a life in a place where none of them had ever been, but all of them desperately needed to reach. Marcus found himself thinking about schools and jobs, and the mundane details of civilian existence that he'd avoided for 8 years, while Zara spoke of medical certifications and the possibility of using her healing knowledge to help other refugees who had endured their own versions of trauma and loss. "I want to learn to read human words," Kira announced during one of their planning sessions, her statement delivered with the serious intensity of someone making a life-altering decision. "And I want to learn about Papa's people, not just Mama's songs." The simple request hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him that he was no longer just a protector or temporary guardian. He was becoming a father to someone who saw him as a permanent part of her family structure. Haven Station materialized out of the void like a promise, kept its massive superstructure glowing with the warm light of inhabited spaces and the steady pulse of defensive energy barriers that marked it as a place where hope still existed in a galaxy that seemed determined to crush it. The station's architecture was an eclectic blend of human engineering and alien aesthetics, reflecting the diverse population of refugees and settlers who had found sanctuary within its protective embrace. "Welcome to Haven Station," came the voice of the docking controller, professional but warm in a way that suggested genuine hospitality rather than mere bureaucratic efficiency. "Please state your business and prepare for standard health and security screenings." The procedures were thorough but respectful, treating the Stardust's passengers as people rather than potential threats or resources to be processed and cataloged. Administrator Chen met them at the airlock, a middle-aged human woman whose eyes held the kind of compassionate authority that came from years of helping people rebuild their lives after losing everything. She studied Marcus, Zara, and Kira with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen every variation of desperation and hope that refugees could embody, her expression shifting from professional assessment to maternal concern as she took in Kira's small form and cautious golden eyes. "Medical refugees from the Rim worlds," Marcus explained, sticking to the cover story they'd rehearsed during the journey. "The child needs specialized care that isn't available in the outer systems." It wasn't entirely a lie. Kira did need care of a sort, though the healing she required was emotional rather than physical. The kind of stability that could only come from knowing she would never again be treated as property to be bought and sold. "Of course," Administrator Chen replied, her tone suggesting that she understood far more about their situation than their carefully crafted story revealed. "We have excellent medical facilities here, and our schools are always happy to welcome new students. Would you like to see the family quarters that are available, or do you prefer to maintain your own accommodation aboard your ship?" The family quarters turned out to be a revelation. 3 connected rooms with real windows that looked out onto the station's central garden, where children of a dozen different species played together under artificial sunlight that felt almost real. Kira pressed her face against the transparent aluminum, her breath fogging the surface, as she watched a group of children her age chase each other through carefully maintained flower beds that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in nature. "Can I go outside?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the illusion of safety and normalcy that surrounded them. "Can I play with the other children?" The question broke Marcus's heart and mended it simultaneously, reminding him of everything they'd fought to achieve and everything they still had to protect. But their arrival at Haven Station had not gone unnoticed by the forces that still hunted them. The Narco Consortium's reach extended far beyond the official boundaries of their territory, maintained through networks of informants and corrupt officials who traded information for credits and protection. Within hours of the Stardust's docking, encrypted messages were speeding through hyperspace toward ships that had been searching the void for 3 weeks without success. The first sign of trouble came during Kira's second day at the station's school, when Marcus noticed unfamiliar faces in the crowd of parents and guardians who gathered each afternoon to collect their children. Men and women who moved with the practiced ease of professionals, their eyes scanning the diverse group of refugee families with the calculating attention of predators evaluating potential prey. He recognized the type from his military service mercenaries and enforcers who operated in the gray areas between legal and necessary. "We have a problem," he told Zara that evening, as they watched Kira sleep peacefully in her new bed surrounded by toys and books that other children had outgrown and donated to newcomers who had arrived with nothing but hope. The consortium has people here, or at least people willing to work for them. We're not as safe as we thought. Zara's bioluminescent markings dimmed with worry, but her voice remained steady as she replied, "Then we need to decide whether to run again or make our stand here." Kira is finally starting to heal from everything she's endured. She has friends now, teachers who care about her progress, a routine that makes her feel secure. If we keep running, we risk damaging her in ways that might never heal. The decision crystallized around that simple truth. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage was refusing to retreat standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Marcus had spent 8 years running from the possibility of loss, avoiding meaningful connections because he couldn't bear the thought of losing someone he cared about. But now he had something worth fighting for, something that belonged in the most powerful HFY stories about ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. The confrontation came 3 days later when a consortium negotiator arrived at Haven Station with official credentials and legal documents claiming ownership of stolen property that needed to be returned to its rightful owners. The negotiator was smooth and professional, dressed in expensive clothes, and speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of legal pressure and implied threats. The Velteran female and her offspring represent significant corporate assets, he explained to Administrator Chen in a meeting that Marcus was allowed to attend as Zara's legal guardian. The consortium has invested considerable resources in their acquisition and processing, and we are prepared to offer substantial compensation to the station administration for facilitating their return to our custody. Haven Station does not recognize slavery in any form, Administrator Chen replied with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with similar threats. The refugees under our protection are free individuals who have requested sanctuary from persecution. We are not in the business of returning people to organizations that treat them as property. The negotiator's pleasant facade cracked slightly, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the veneer of civilized discourse. Perhaps the administrator misunderstands the legal realities of the situation. The consortium operates under legitimate business licenses issued by recognized governmental authorities. Our recovery operations are conducted in accordance with established commercial law, and interference with those operations can have serious consequences for neutral parties who choose to involve themselves in private disputes. Marcus felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders the moment when choice became destiny, and good intentions were tested against harsh realities. He could see the fear in other refugee families' eyes as word of the consortium's presence spread through the station, could feel the fragile sense of security that Haven Station represented, beginning to crack under the pressure of forces too powerful for any sanctuary to resist indefinitely. "She's family," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the negotiator's veiled threats with the simple power of absolute conviction. Not property, not merchandise, not an asset to be recovered. She's my family, and I don't negotiate with people who traffic in human misery. The words carried the weight of everything he'd learned about love and sacrifice, and the lengths people would go to protect those they cherished most. The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring filled with implications and possibilities that none of them fully understood yet. Then Administrator Chen smiled an expression that transformed her face from professional courtesy to something approaching maternal pride. "Haven Station stands with its residents," she announced, her voice carrying throughout the meeting room with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "We do not surrender our people to anyone regardless of the legal documentation they present or the threats they make." What happened next would become legend among the refugee communities that scattered throughout the galaxy. A story that demonstrated how ordinary people could stand against overwhelming odds when they fought for something that mattered more than their own safety. The united front that Haven Station presented forced the consortium to recalculate their approach to weigh the costs of direct confrontation against the value of their claimed property. For the first time since leaving Omega Station, Marcus allowed himself to believe that they might actually win this fight, that the sanctuary they'd found could become the permanent home that Kira deserved. But even as he celebrated their first real victory, Marcus knew that the war was far from over. The Consortium didn't retreat easily, and Captain Vex's personal vendetta would ensure that this defeat only strengthened their enemies' resolve to reclaim what they saw as stolen merchandise. The price of freedom had been paid in blood and sacrifice, but the cost of keeping that freedom would prove even higher. Still, as he watched Kira laugh with her new friends in the station's garden, Marcus understood that some things were worth any price, and some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Their story was becoming one of the most compelling space opera narratives ever told, a testament to the power of chosen family and the unbreakable bonds that made ordinary people capable of extraordinary heroism. 6 months had passed since Haven Station's defiant stand against the Consortium's demands, 6 months during which life had found its rhythm in ways that transformed survival into something approaching genuine happiness. Kira attended school each morning with the eager enthusiasm of someone discovering that learning could be joy rather than burden, her golden eyes bright with curiosity as she absorbed lessons in mathematics, xenobiology, and the dozen different languages spoken by her classmates. Zara had established herself as the station's chief medical officer, her healing knowledge valued not just for its technical precision, but for the compassionate way she treated patients who carried their own histories of trauma and loss. Marcus had accepted the role of security chief with the quiet competence of someone who understood that protecting this sanctuary required both strength and wisdom, his military experience finally finding purpose in something greater than mere survival. The man who had once avoided meaningful connections now found himself at the center of a community that looked to him for leadership, and the irony was not lost on him that his greatest act of love had been learning to let others depend on him again. "Papa, why are we different from other families?" Kira asked one evening as they sat together in their quarters, her small fingers tracing the bioluminescent patterns that decorated a traditional Velteran scroll Zara had been teaching her to read. The question came with the kind of innocent directness that children possessed, cutting straight to the heart of complexities that adults spent years trying to understand or explain. Marcus looked up from the security reports he'd been reviewing, meeting Zara's eyes across the room, where she sat preparing lesson plans for the medical training program she'd developed for other refugees. They had known this conversation would come eventually, had prepared for it, in the way that parents prepare for all the difficult questions that growing children inevitably ask. But knowing something is coming and being ready for it are entirely different things, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with shaping a young mind's understanding of the world. Different how? He asked, gently setting aside his work to give Kira his full attention. This was what made their story more than just another space adventure. It was becoming one of those profound, found family stories that explored the deepest questions about identity, belonging, and what it truly meant to be connected to other people in ways that transcended the accidents of biology. "Well," Kira said, her voice taking on the thoughtful tone she used when working through complex ideas, "most of my friends have parents who look like them, or at least come from the same worlds. And their families all started the same way, with people who chose each other and then had children together. But we're different. You chose Mama after I was already here, and Mama chose you and I chose both of you, but none of us look the same or come from the same places." The observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact precision of someone stating obvious truths, but Marcus could hear the underlying uncertainty in her voice, the child's need to understand where she fit in a universe that seemed to operate according to rules she was still learning. Zara rose from her chair and crossed the room to sit beside them, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with the gentle rhythm that indicated deep thought. "Family isn't about blood, little star. Zara said softly, using the pet name that had evolved from the Velteran endearment she'd whispered during those dark nights when survival had seemed impossible. It's about choice. It's about people who decide they want to share their lives with each other, who commit to taking care of each other no matter what challenges they face. Marcus nodded, remembering his own childhood questions about adoption and belonging, though his circumstances had been far less dramatic than Kira's. Some families start with love and then add children, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned these truths through hard experience. Other families start with need and grow into love. What matters isn't how you begin, but what you build together along the way. Kira considered this for a moment, her golden eyes moving between the two adults who had become the anchors of her universe. So, we're not weird. We're just different kinds of normal. The hope in her voice was unmistakable, the child's desire to understand that her experience of family was valid, even if it didn't match the patterns she observed in other households. We're exactly the kind of normal that matters, Marcus replied, reaching out to tuck a strand of silver-white hair behind her ear. We're the kind of family that proves love is stronger than circumstance, that connection is more important than convention. The words felt true, in a way that surprised him, marking how far he'd traveled from the bitter isolation that had defined his life before he'd met them in that desperate place where everything had changed. But even as they celebrated these moments of domestic happiness, the shadows of their past continued to move in the darkness beyond Haven Station's protective barriers. Captain Vex had not forgotten his humiliation at the hands of a refugee family and their sanctuary community, and the resources at his disposal far exceeded anything a single station could muster in its own defense. The consortium's patience was legendary, matched only by their determination to reclaim what they considered stolen property. The first sign of renewed trouble came through Marcus's security channels' encrypted messages from contacts in the Rim worlds who monitored criminal organization movements for stations like Haven. Multiple consortium vessels massing in the Kepler sector, read one report. Configuration suggests major operation planned. Estimated timeline 2 to 3 weeks. The clinical language couldn't disguise the implications. They were facing a force large enough to overwhelm Haven Station's defenses through sheer numbers. Marcus called an emergency meeting with Administrator Chen and the station's senior staff, spreading the intelligence reports across the conference table like evidence of an approaching storm. "They're not coming to negotiate this time," he said, his voice carrying the grim certainty of someone who understood military tactics. "This is a full-scale operation designed to eliminate Haven Station as a sanctuary and send a message to other communities that might consider defying consortium interests." "How long do we have?" Administrator Chen asked, her face reflecting the weight of responsibility for 30,000 refugees who had made Haven Station their home. The question carried implications that extended far beyond mere logistics. Families would need to be evacuated, essential personnel reassigned, and an entire community's worth of dreams and hopes uprooted once again. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we're lucky, Marcus replied. But evacuation isn't really an option. We don't have enough transport capacity for everyone, and most of our residents have nowhere else to go. This is their last chance for safety, their final refuge from forces that want to reduce them to property or eliminate them entirely. The brutal arithmetic of their situation left no room for comfortable illusions about alternatives. Zara had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through the worst that the galaxy could offer. "Then we fight," she said simply. "Not because we want to, but because some things are worth defending regardless of the cost. These people trusted us to provide sanctuary, and we don't betray that trust just because the challenge becomes difficult." The preparation for siege transformed Haven Station from peaceful sanctuary into fortress. But it was a fortress built on hope rather than hatred, defended by people who fought not for conquest, but for the right to exist safely in a universe that seemed determined to crush the vulnerable. Marcus found himself coordinating with military advisors who had sought refuge on the station, former soldiers and security personnel who understood that this battle would determine not just their own fate, but the future of refugee sanctuaries throughout the galaxy. Training sessions filled the station's recreational areas as civilians learned to operate defensive systems and coordinate evacuation procedures while engineers worked around the clock to upgrade weapon systems and reinforce critical infrastructure. But perhaps more importantly, the community came together in ways that demonstrated why they were worth defending in the first place: families sharing resources, neighbors caring for each other's children. People of dozen different species united by their common commitment to building something better than the worlds they'd fled. "I want to help," Kira announced one evening, as Marcus reviewed tactical projections in their quarters. She stood in the doorway with the serious expression she wore when making important decisions, her small form radiating determination that reminded him powerfully of her mother's courage in the face of impossible odds. "You are helping," Marcus replied gently. "By being safe, by continuing to go to school and learn and grow into the person you're meant to become. That's what we're fighting, to protect your right to have a normal childhood and a future filled with possibilities rather than fear." But Kira shook her head with the stubborn certainty of someone who had inherited both parents' tendency toward self-sacrifice. "That's not enough. This is my home too, my family too. If the bad men want to hurt us, then I should do something to stop them. I'm not just a little kid anymore. I'm old enough to understand what's happening and why it matters." The conversation that followed revealed how much their precocious daughter had grown during their months of sanctuary, how the security and love they'd provided had allowed her natural intelligence and courage to flourish. She understood the stakes they faced, comprehended that this battle would determine whether places like Haven Station could continue to exist, and she wanted to contribute in whatever way her abilities allowed. "There is something you can do," Zara said, joining the conversation with the thoughtful expression that meant she'd been considering possibilities. "Your gift with languages, your ability to translate between different species, we're going to need communication coordinators who can help refugees from different worlds work together during the crisis. It's dangerous in its own way, but it's also vital to our defense." The role they carved out for Kira transformed her from protected child to contributing member of their community's defense, though they were careful to keep her away from the most dangerous aspects of preparation. She worked with communication teams helping translate emergency procedures into the dozen languages spoken by Haven Station's residents, and served as liaison between families who were struggling to understand the technical aspects of their defensive preparations. Marcus watched his daughter, for that was what she had become in every way that mattered. Throw herself into these responsibilities with the focused intensity that characterized everything she did. The girl who had once asked if she would be thrown away for eating too much had grown into someone who understood that love meant taking responsibility for the people you cared about, that being part of a family required contributing to its welfare and protection. The night before the consortium fleet was scheduled to arrive, Marcus and Zara sat together on their small balcony overlooking the station's central garden, watching Kira play with her friends under the artificial stars that provided Haven Station with the illusion of open sky. The scene was peaceful in a way that belonged in the most heartwarming sci-fi stories, but it was shadowed by the knowledge that this might be their last quiet evening together. "I need to tell you something," Zara said, her voice carrying a weight that made Marcus turn his full attention toward her. "About why the consortium is so determined to reclaim me, why they're willing to risk so much for one refugee and her child." Her bioluminescent markings had taken on a pattern he'd never seen before, pulsing with colors that suggested deep anxiety mixed with resolve. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, though something in her tone made his stomach clench with anticipation of revelations that would change everything he thought he understood about their situation. Zara took a deep breath, gathering herself for a confession that had been years in the making. "I'm not just a refugee from Veltara. I'm not just another Veltaran who lost her mate to the sky sickness. I'm Princess Zara, heir to the Veltaran throne, daughter of the ruling house that was overthrown when the mining consortium poisoned our world's atmosphere. The consortium didn't just traffic me randomly. They specifically targeted me because my bloodline represents the last legitimate claim to Veltara's government. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything he thought he knew about their journey from desperate rescue to galactic conspiracy. This wasn't just about recovering valuable property. It was about eliminating a political threat that could someday challenge the consortium's control over an entire world. The woman he loved wasn't just a refugee. She was the rightful ruler of a civilization that had been deliberately destroyed to facilitate corporate exploitation. Kira isn't just my daughter. Zara continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally shared the truth she'd hidden for so long. She's the last princess of Veltara, the only hope her people have for someday reclaiming their world from the forces that poisoned it. That's why the consortium will never stop hunting us, why they're willing to destroy an entire sanctuary to eliminate the threat we represent. As the implications of this revelation settled over them, Marcus realized that their story was becoming something far more significant than he'd ever imagined. Not just a tale of found family and personal redemption, but a saga that could reshape the balance of power in their sector of the galaxy. The greatest test was indeed yet to come, and its outcome would determine not just their family's survival, but the fate of an entire civilization that had been written off as extinct. The next 24 hours would prove whether love really could conquer the forces of exploitation and greed, or whether some enemies were simply too powerful for hope to overcome. Marcus Kane's journey from broken loner to protective father proves that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion isn't fighting the system, it's choosing to love someone the system has written off as worthless. In our own world, millions of refugees, displaced families, and forgotten children need someone to see their humanity when others see only problems to be managed. The courage to extend kindness to strangers, to choose family over convenience, to stand up for those who can't defend themselves. These aren't just themes for science fiction stories. They're choices we make every single day that determine what kind of galaxy we're building together. Welcome to Galactic Sci-Fi Saga, where humanity doesn't just survive the cosmos, we transform it through acts of compassion that echo across the stars. This channel is your sanctuary for original HFY audiobooks that celebrate the human spirit's ability to find hope in the darkest corners of space, to build families from the fragments of broken worlds, and to prove that love really can conquer forces that seem insurmountable. Every story we tell explores what happens when ordinary people make extraordinary choices, when the forgotten rise up to reshape entire civilizations. If Marcus and Zara's story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest releases. Turn off your ad blocker to support independent storytelling that puts heart over algorithms, and drop a comment sharing your own thoughts about found family second chances or what this story meant to you personally. Your engagement doesn't just help the channel grow. It builds a community of people who believe stories can change the world. You're now part of the Galactic Sci-Fi Saga family, joining thousands of listeners who gather here every week to explore what it means to be human in an infinite universe. Whether you're a parent fighting for your children's future, someone who's ever felt like an outcast looking for belonging, or just someone who believes that kindness is the most powerful force in any galaxy, remember this: every small act of love ripples outward in ways we can't imagine. Sometimes saving the universe starts with simply refusing to throw someone away. The stars are waiting. What story will you write among them?